Hamilton Lugar School and to the afternoon session of day one of our annual conference on America's role in the world. Carl Gershman, our moderator for this panel, asked me to open with a few words. We're all eager to hear from the outstanding scholars on this panel, so I'll be brief. This year's conference is time for the presidential transition and for an administration which has identified support for democracy as a linchpin of its foreign policy. In the morning session, I had the chance to talk with Rohingya democracy activist and former political prisoner Wai Wai Nu, now in the United States as a fellow of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I'm a trustee, and she'll be a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy in the spring. Among the issues that we discussed, and really a theme that flowed through the entire discussion, was the unfavorable international, economic, and geopolitical context she and her fellow democracy activists face in Burma. That's a set of circumstances expertly traced by Larry Diamond, one of our panelists, in an important new article in Democratization, which has given this panel its name: The Global Transition from a Long-Standing Democratic Recession to a Third Reverse Democratic Wave. It's an urgent issue, and I would say one that's not adequately understood at home or globally. So I look forward to this discussion and our expert panelists, and I'll be taking notes. Two additional points about why here and why now. We're also taking the opportunity at this conference to celebrate the birthday, a little bit early, of one of our namesakes, Lee Hamilton, who spoke earlier today and is watching now. The congressman, of course, was a board member of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the co-sponsor of this panel. And so too was the other of our namesakes, Senator Lugar, who is a longstanding member of the board too. And I know Carl Gershman very much valued the participation of these two gentle giants of American foreign policy. So it's especially appropriate for us to meet here and now. Also, finally, just a word or two about Carl. Carl, thank you, not only for co-sponsoring this conference, but also for organizing it. Carl is always ensuring his colleagues remain up to date on essential readings, particularly regarding democracy, like those of our panelists. Thank you for your determined work. Thank you for the unique combination of scholarship and advocacy that is a trademark of NED under your leadership. Carl, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lee. And it's just a great pleasure to work with you personally and also to co-sponsor this with the Lugar Hamilton School. And what a great thrill it is to have this panel in honor of Lee Hamilton, who, as you know, was a NED board member. And I love your term, a gentle giant, which is what he was. When I invited one of our speakers, Min Jin Pei, to be part of the panel, he immediately wrote back saying that he was delighted to accept because both Lee Hamilton and Dick Lugar represent, in his view, the most noble American values and ideals. And Lee, since you're listening, I wanted you to know that I've been in touch with another NED board member, David Skaggs, who was a colleague of yours in the Congress when you were there. He's from Colorado. I asked him to share his thoughts with me, and he said that your voice of calm and deliberate analysis was always welcome and often served as an essential antidote to the impassioned approaches of some members in the Congress who hadn't really thought through the sensitive the implications in very sensitive situations, and that your judgment was always, or almost always, confirmed by events because you had taken the trouble to understand both the intended and the unintended consequences. And I wanted you to know that David sends his respect and affection to you, as do we all. Our panel, as Lee noted, will address the issue of how to do what we can at this unique moment in US history to reverse the anti-democratic wave. And we have a terrific panel with Larry Diamond, who is arguably our country's leading specialist on democracy, both as a scholar and an advocate. We have also Min-Jin Pei, who is one of the very leading China scholars. And I want to note that two days from now, on Thursday evening at 8 p.m., Min-Jin will be delivering Ned's annual Seymour Martin Lipset lecture on democracy in the world. And his theme will be totalitarianism's long dark shadow over China. And everyone who is at this discussion today, you're all invited. Lee and his team, Lee Feinstein and his team, have information on that. You could also access the meeting from the NED website. And also we have Michelle Dunn, who is one of our leading specialists on the Middle East, and also a NED board member, and Alina Polyakova, who has taken over as the new president of the Center for European Policy Analysis and is a leading specialist on Russia, Central Europe, and the entire post-communist region. Larry, we're going to begin with you, and Lee's already mentioned your essay, not only your essay, but also the fact, and I think this is for the first time, Larry, that you, who coined the term recession to define the period of democratic decline since 2005, this is really the first time that you've used the Huntingtonian term reverse third wave. And tell us why you've done that, Larry, and then maybe you can also speculate on what, at this new moment in U.S. History, where we do have a new president coming in who has professed his commitment to advancing democracy, what can be done to try to reverse that reverse third wave? Larry?
Well, thank you, Carl. That's a tall order for a few minutes. I do want to begin by congratulating and extending best wishes, not only to the Hamilton Lugar Center, but to Lee Hamilton personally. I share with my fellow panelists a very deep admiration for this man and both of the great Americans who've given their names to this center. It's really an honor to participate, Carl. Professor Sam Huntington, an original founding board member of the Journal of Democracy, described the reverse wave as a period of time in which significantly more countries are moving away from democracy than to democracy. And that is the period that we have entered into in the last few years. Carl, as you know, I've been arguing for some time now that I think we entered a period of global democratic recession around 2006. We can show with a variety of data I do in that article that democratic expansion and the expansion of freedom in the world essentially ground to a halt around 2006. And we entered a period of stagnation and gradual deterioration in the quality of democracy and a rising pace, and now I'd say a sharply rising pace in recent years of democratic breakdowns. But more to the point, the last 5 years represent the first 5-year period since the start of the third wave of democratization in 1974, in which more countries moved away from democracy than to democracy. And this is also in part because, as I noted, virtually none of the countries that are seeing mass mobilizations for democracy, whether it's in Venezuela or Sudan, although we don't know what the outcome will be in Sudan or Algeria or Lebanon or elsewhere, are actually seeing them bear fruit and give rise to a new democratic regime. Ethiopia is stuck as well, and we could go down the list. And we see movement downward away from freedom and democracy in every category of regime. The liberal democracies have been experiencing erosion of their liberal practices. And one liberal democracy in Europe has now become an authoritarian regime, namely Hungary. Another, Poland, is certainly on a downward slide. The electoral democracies in many cases are abandoning democracy altogether. And we've had a rising tide of democratic breakdowns in many of these countries, such as Turkey, for example. I mentioned Venezuela earlier. and some time ago, more recently, I think the Philippines, and most alarmingly, we see these trends of rising pressure on civil society, on judicial independence, on intellectual freedom, and so on, in the world's biggest democracy, India, which is now treading a trajectory that has some alarming similarities to the earlier days in Turkey. And when you mention Turkey, and I'm sorry to say, when you mention the Modi government in India, you have to mention the word illiberal populism and the process by which intolerant, power-aggrandizing, demagogic populists abuse power and marginalize minorities, marginalize opposition, and gradually destroy democracy, as Orban and Erdogan have done. We crossed a threshold last year. For the first time since 1991, the majority of states over 1 million population are no longer democracies. That is a very sobering statistic. The Varieties of Democracies Project has come to a similar judgment with more refined methodology than I'm using, which simply asks whether a country meets the minimal standards of electoral democracy. So I'll just briefly note some of the factors that are driving this and then lay on the table some of the policy responses. Many of these countries have weak institutions. Democracy was never consolidated, as we call it. The rule of law is weak. Countervailing institutions of power in the legislature and the judiciary have lacked strength and resilience. Very crucially, I'm sure Minchin will speak to this. It really matters a lot in Huntington's theory. There's been a shift in the global balance of power with the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia, which now create alternative models of governance and alternative sources of geopolitical support and financial support to governments in Africa, governments in Asia, and elsewhere in the world to enable them to detach themselves from Western conditionality, Western democratic expectations, and not fear any consequences. And it's the lack of fear of consequences that is driving now the crackdown on human rights and freedom and democracy in Uganda, in Ethiopia, in Egypt, in Thailand, and in so many other countries around the world. They just figure the West isn't going to do anything, Europe isn't going to do anything, the United States isn't going to do very much. If they try to, they'll just get more aid from China, they'll get geopolitical support from Russia. And so there's these alternative poles of power and influence in the world now that they can turn to. And this is happening at a time when the model of democratic governance, particularly in the United States, but in parts of Europe as well, has been tarnished by defections from democratic standards and by defections from efficacious government, particularly in the wake of the COVID pandemic, with the United States having one of the worst performances in managing the COVID pandemic of any country in the world. And of course, China has done, even though it's the source of the pandemic, reasonably well in controlling it. And now I'll let Minchin speak to this, but plays it up as a model. And then we've got these great global changes in the world, the great accelerations Tom Friedman has written about, that are creating tension and anxiety that I think are ripe territory for exploitation by demagogic populists. Globalization in terms of the movement of peoples, driving immigration and more social and ethnic pluralism, globalization in terms of the movement of goods and jobs and the displacement of jobs and rising inequality, technological disruption, further displacing people from jobs by automation, and then the the most universal disruptor of all to democracy in the age we live in now, social media, driving people into these separate worlds of information and tribal opinion and political identity, and driving severe polarization. I don't have a magic solution to that, but Carl, I would conclude by saying, in terms of what to do about it, that I do think we need to return to some Huntingtonian principles in his book, The Third Wave, that power matters, and that we have to restore American power and the power of our example in the world if we're going to begin to reverse this authoritarian tide. We need to once again wage a battle of ideas and meet the People's Republic of China head on that plane of battle, both in terms of information contestation and in terms of confronting their model square on and noting its abridgments of freedom, its corruption, and its cynicism. I think we need a new generation of diplomacy for democracy to stand up for human rights and defend human rights defenders. And as I've said before, including in my book, Ill Winds, we've got to take to a new level the global battle against kleptocracy and implement new institutions and rules in our own countries. Maybe Alina will have something to say about this. I know she's been concerned about this, that will fight the flow of dirty money and the ability of corrupt oligarchs and money launderers to undermine the rule of law in our own democracies.
Thank you, Larry. You know, it's a very stark picture. I take it all of your concluding comments are what you would urge the Biden administration to try to take on as its new agenda. It's obviously not a short list. It's a very ambitious list. I might note that The Economist, a magazine this week, has a cover story on the resilience of democracy. And maybe before we move on to the others, you'll just say a word about that. Are they being overly optimistic? Or do you think that democracy really has the capacity, because of its resilience, its ability to self-correct, to recover from the difficult period that we've been in?
Well, I would say that I'm a great believer in democracy, Carl, and in the creativity and capacity for renewal of democracies. And of course, that's been part of the call for global call for democratic renewal that Ned has helped to inspire, that you might want to say a word about. But democratic reform, renewal, and resilience, just like democratic transition or democratic defense, they don't happen on their own. It requires people and organizations to do these things and fight for these things. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are facing, severe institutional deficiencies in the United States, which have been exposed in recent years and that require reform. I think a lot was done to modernize our electoral administration and produce a secure election in the United States that we can take some pride in, despite the current partisan efforts to denigrate it and deny the reality of it. But we're not doing well, many of the democracies, not just the United States, but Spain, the UK, Italy, and some other democracies in managing COVID. We're not mobilizing the kind of societal response that we need to in terms of making sacrifices for the larger good. We're not doing a very good job of fighting disinformation, rumor mongering, and hyperpolarization online in the sewer of falsehood and intolerance that social media have become. We have a lot of work to do, and resilience is not going to happen on its own. You've got to have a plan, an organization, and an inspiration to make it happen.
Okay, great. We'll come back to this because there's already been some questions related to your last point about the the sewer of intolerance that is encouraged by social media. But before we do that, Minjin, I'm going to turn to you now. And I already said you're giving the Lipset lecture on the totalitarian system in China. And China today is not the Soviet Union in the 1980s. It's much, much more potent economically, and it also has a surveillance state, which is, comprehensive in a very unprecedented way. And the system seems, on the surface, Minjin, to be invulnerable. I know you don't think it is, but tell us tell us what you think are the strengths and the vulnerabilities of the Chinese system today, and what the possibilities are for change, and how that can be encouraged by the United States. Minjin.
Thank you so much, Carl, for having me on this panel. And it's always great to follow Larry. I fully concur that any discussion of democratic recession or reversal must take into account the international environment. And today, it is impossible to talk about democratic recession or challenge to the liberal democratic order without thinking about China and China's dark role in this very unpleasant and very worrisome development. And it also happens that the reversal began around, according to Larry, around 2006. And that coincided with a rapid change in global balance of power, marked by China's rise. In 2000, China's contribution to global GDP, measured in purchasing power parity, was only about 7%. Today, it is about 20%. So you could see that within 2 decades, in relative terms, China's influence rose roughly threefold. And in that period, you also witness a much more aggressive and in terms of its domestic politics, much more repressive China. So China's challenge to the liberal international order comes from 3 angles or 3 dimensions. First, I would say domestic. We have to, when we think about China, what China does internally is of profound concern to all of us, not just in terms of the abuse of human rights and ethnic minorities, but in terms of its domestic evolution. That is, just imagine a world in which China is not as dictatorial or repressive as it is. It's a very different world. But within China, as a result of the return to what I would call neo-Stalinist rule under Xi Jinping, the path to an evolutionary change of the political system has been now blocked. And the regime's short-term economic performance has given the Chinese Communist Party, which is the ruling party in China, not only a high degree of performance legitimacy, but also enormous resources to strengthen its repressive apparatus and its surveillance state. Without the extra economic resources, it is really difficult to imagine that the Chinese Communist Party can have such a strong hold on its power. So that is the first angle from which the Chinese system undermines or threatens the global liberal order. The second is ideological. That is, China, thanks to its economic success over the last really 4 decades, now has an alternative narrative that can be considered some kind of competition, ideological competition to the West. I have to say that this narrative is particularly attractive and appealing in the developing world. In the developed world, it is still a toss-up. I think some people would look at China and say, well, they've done well, but others will say, wait a minute, they've not done so well. But in the developing world, if you look at opinion surveys, China does have a considerable degree of ideological appeal, thanks mainly to its perceived success in economic development. And the third angle is geopolitical. And this is the most serious threat to the liberal international order. As we can see that over the last 2 decades, as the Chinese economy gains strength, the Chinese Communist Party has been able to invest a huge amount of resources in beefing up its military, which it now constitutes a real competitive threat to the US and to its neighbors. And China has also invested a huge amount of resources in projecting both its hard power through Belt and Road Initiative, and also through its economic aid. When you look at China's economic aid, you will find that China actually favors a lot of autocracies, places like Cuba, Cambodia, that receive, and Central Asian countries that receive, proportionally speaking, a lot more Chinese aid than other countries. So China now is really a genuine and substantial threat to the liberal international order because of its rapid increase in economic and military hard power. But in the long run, I'm actually quite optimistic. I think we are experiencing a momentary period of darkness. That is because of 2 things. I believe that first, that the current policies of the Chinese government are not sustainable in the long run. These are policies that are very risky in terms of the geopolitical competition or conflict with the West, that do not show a clear direction in re-energizing China's economic growth. One thing we need to be aware of that China's economic growth has been losing momentum. And this is structural. This is not cyclical. And the current policies which favor state control over market reform will unlikely reverse that direction. And so we should not think that the Chinese system is poised to deliver sustained long-term growth. At the same time, we should be actually very optimistic about the power of liberal democracies to revive its fortune. That is, we look at the last election in the US, we look at recent waning of populism around the world, even though I think we still have a period of struggle ahead. When we look at the long run, if democracies play the long game, first and foremost by strengthening democratic institutions at home, by addressing the social economic threats to democracy, especially inequality and ethnic and identity politics, I'm very confident that 10, 20 years from now, we're going to see a very different picture. Thank you.
You mentioned one issue which I'd just like you to address before we move on is the whole issue of the surveillance state. I mean, this is so new. It is so comprehensive. There's a new book out on this. You may have seen it by Kai Strittmatter called, We Have Been Harmonized, Life in China's Surveillance State. And it's just, it's the worst with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, East Turkestan, but it affects everyone, whether you can get a driver's license, whether you can get a home. They seem to be able to, they know about everyone, and they're even getting technology from the West to do this. Why is that not a game changer?
This is, I would call this an experiment. That is whether technology will help a fundamentally delegitimized regime survive. This has never been done. I actually happen to be working on a book on the Chinese surveillance state. I call it Guarding Dictatorship, and it should be done in about 2 years. So so in 2 years' time, I can come back and share with you my findings. My basic conclusion, based on what I've found so far, is that the surveillance state or capabilities of placing practically the entire population under strict technological surveillance does, on the margins, strengthen the capability of a regime, of an authoritarian regimes. But fundamentally, it will not when that regime loses its legitimacy, it will not be able to survive on the basis of technological surveillance alone. The basis for my optimism comes from the Soviet experience and the Eastern European experience. When communism collapsed in 1989, I bet the East German surveillance state and the KGB in the former Soviet Union were just as capable as they were 10, 15 years ago. But when the entire regime, the elites in those regimes became thoroughly demoralized, when civil society became mobilized, surveillance alone could not save a regime discredited by its poor economic performance and undermined by geopolitical competition with the West. So that's why I do not believe that surveillance alone, however technologically empowered, will allow a fundamentally discredited regime to survive.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. I mentioned before to Michelle and Alina that we would have Michelle go next, but because you've just said that about the Soviet model, I'm going to switch the order. And Alina, I'm going to turn to you to respond to what Minjin just said, but also to respond to a couple of other things. One, Larry pointed out of, the retreat in Hungary, which is now, he characterized it as an authoritarian state in Poland, and what can be done there. And then also the crisis in Russia today, with Russia, stagnating economically, getting worse with the pandemic and low oil prices. And then there's even an article I saw in the paper today about its demographic problem, the population decline. Speak, if you would, in response to Minjin's, what he just said about the crisis in Russia and what your sense is about the possibility for democracy to recover in the post-Soviet regions that you look at. Alina.
Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you, Minjin, and thank you, Larry, for bringing me into the conversation a little earlier than anticipated. It's already been fascinating to hear from both of you, and I think it's a really important conversation that we're having here today. To follow up directly at what Minjin had said, I think this is such a critical point that surveillance alone cannot safeguard an authoritarian state. And I would even go one step further than what Minjin said about what we can learn from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yes, it was an economically inefficient model, and those inefficiencies are very much felt by the population at certain points of the Soviet Union's existence. Yes, it couldn't outcompete at a geopolitical level the United States and the broader Western alliance, but I think there was a more profound problem there. And this is just speaking from personal experience, having grown up for some of my life in the Soviet Union. And that was really this profound disillusionment at the societal level with the ideological basis of that regime. And once you lost, meaning the regime lost the hearts and minds of its citizens, it really didn't matter what the rest was. It didn't matter that suddenly in the 80s, because of Gorbachev's policies, you finally had access to Western consumer goods that everybody wanted for decades. People were willing to suffer much greater economic strains when they believed in the ideological foundations of the state. And once that was lost, and I would not underestimate how much Chernobyl actually contributed to that, and just a massive disaster which the state tried to hide from its own people, but which we learned about from Western Russian language media. And this takes me, I think, to your other point, Carl, about how important it is to continue to invest in our ability to project democratic values and principles across the world. And certainly the politicization of services like VOA, the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that's currently been happening in the United States, is a disservice to our ability to project values and principles abroad, to say the very least. Because speaking of the long game, that Minjin also alluded to for democratic resilience, that is part of the long game, investing in our ability to message. Because at the end of the day, you may ask lots of respondents across the world, as Larry said, about various survey questions about satisfaction with democracy. Would you like to live in a democratic society? Do you like the idea of democracy? How many times you ask it, we see in many parts of the world, I think, Larry, you know this far better than I do, but we see a decline. But if you ask people about universal values that are enshrined in the concept of democracy, do you want to have the freedom to decide your own fate? Do you want your children to have more opportunities than you do? When you ask people those kinds of questions, then I think we have a very different outcome. And so I think while democracy as a concept, as a term, may not be having its heyday, the values and principles and ideas that it represents, that living in a democratic society represents, are still universal values. And I think when it comes to Central Eastern Europe and what's happening in the broader post-Soviet space, I think there's a much more positive story there than if you look a little bit beyond the surface. One, Belarus and the ongoing protests in Belarus. I think even for those of us who study the region, who keep a close eye on developments, the pro-democratic protests against the rigged election of Alexander Lukashenko came as a huge surprise. The massive mobilization of society, when I think most had assumed, because of a lack of access to information, that Lukashenko had built this monolithic authoritarian state in which there was no room for maneuver, there was no room for people's movements. And we see that there was room and there is room. That doesn't mean that the outcome will be what we want to see. That is very much in a stalemate. But what it signals very clearly is that even in the last dictatorship in Europe, where we assumed was going to be there indefinitely, frankly, that is really not the case, because people don't want to live in a repressive regime at the end of the day. And even if we look at Hungary, a huge issue for Europe, huge issue for the Transatlantic Alliance, the kind of backsliding we've seen in Hungary over the last decades under Viktor Orban was certainly not anticipated by anyone when Hungary joined the EU. That's part of the reasons why there's no exit mechanism for countries that slip off the democratic path, because I think that was unimaginable in the 1990s. But now we know that the linear arc of history is not so linear. But if you look at local level developments in Hungary, we have an opposition mayor in Budapest. We have an opposition mayor in Warsaw. We have an opposition mayor in Prague, in Bratislava. So at the local level, we still see quite a bit of movement. We see the people's ability to organize politically, to organize societally, to fight for the values and freedoms. Of course, there's huge divisions. I think polarization, more so than anything, whether it be urban, rural, right, left, religious polarization, that to my mind is one of the biggest issues that's undermining our ability to have a democratic governance structure. And I think we should really talk about that. But my final thing I'll say on some of my opening comments is that, the title of this panel assumes that we switch from a democratic recession to an anti-democratic wave. And I'm not so sure about that. I think we have to question that premise, and we shouldn't take it as an assumption, because as Timothy Garton Ash recently said, in some of his comments I listened to, we assumed in the 1990s, perhaps, that we were on this linear path towards democratic freedom and democratization across the world. And now we know that was a false assumption that some of us made. I think now, we're in danger of committing the same false assumption, which is assuming that we're moving towards this linear trajectory towards authoritarianism. And that is also not the case. I think what we realize, as Larry aptly put it, democracy is not an end state, and it's not static. And it's something that we constantly have to work at and build. And I think we are seeing that across certainly the post-Soviet space to look at very closely. But it's a very bumpy road. I think the big question is, what do international institutions that may not have taken democratic values and principles as something that they have to be a part of instituting, meaning NATO, for example, I think has taken democracy as a bit for granted. Other multilateral institutions, what is their role? What is our role in the United States, given the challenges we face? I think those are the real questions we need to be talking about rather than assuming that we're already in the anti-democratic wave.
Right. And Alina, I want to just ask you to say a word about Russia, because Larry made a big point of that. It was, Russia being much more assertive in pushing its values, and yet nowhere in terms of this crisis of what you call ideology, a crisis of a political crisis, is it more severe, it seems to me at least, than in Putin's Russia. I noticed, a couple of months ago when they had the local elections in Russia, there was this mayor in the Kostroma region, I'm sure you're aware of this, that he needed an opponent. So he actually asked his cleaning lady to be his opponent in the local election. And it was a landslide. She killed him in a landslide because he was so unpopular, and he was a member of Putin's party, United Russia. There is a deep political crisis there, but the question is how serious, and Minjin is looking down the road for a crisis in China, but are we much closer to that in Russia?
Russia's an interesting conundrum, because your example of this local politics, local races, that the Kremlin didn't pay much attention to until very recently. They focused on consolidating support at the national level, but they let local politics just play out as they may. And that was frankly much more of a capacity question than anything else. If you're in Kostroma or in the Russian Far East or in Buryatia, Moscow seems really far away, and Moscow is far away. And so what we've seen, from this wonderful example that you just described, Carl, is that, you talk to Russians candidly, one-on-one. Unfortunately, these conversations don't seep out into public discourse because of the kind of repression we see in Russia. But if you talk to Russian citizens one-on-one across Russia, of course, it's all anecdotal. So you never see this in surveys, I would imagine. There is widespread cynicism. There is widespread discontent. They see the corruption. Russians aren't idiots. They're very savvy people, just like many people across the world. They see how they are not profiting from the fruit of their labor. They see that every turn they have to bribe someone to get anything basic done. They see that Moscow looks glitzy and fantastic, but you drive 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers outside the city center, and you're in a underdeveloped country. In some cases with whole towns that look like they have gone through a nuclear holocaust because they're abandoned and dilapidated. And people see that and they understand that a lot of it has to do with corruption, with theft of public resources and misuse of those resources. Does that mean, to get to your question, Carl, that the regime is more fragile than it looks? I actually don't think so. I think this regime has figured out a way to muddle through and muddle along for a very long time. We have seen them in recent years, the Kremlin and the security services, focus on delegitimizing local politics, obviously harassing, poisoning. Alexei Navalny, not the only Russian opposition leader that has suffered this fate, many others like Vladimir Kara-Murza, not to even talk about Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered in cold blood 5 years ago in Moscow. The regime feels very anxious, but they have also done, I think, an impressive job, frankly, given the kinds of resources they have. They don't have Beijing's resources to suppress, repress, and frighten people out of speaking out in public. And that is the unfortunate part. But at some point, change will come to Russia. I'm not saying we need to be naive and ignorant and assume we're going to have a democratic Russia in 10 or 15 or 20 years, but change will come. And I think it has to be up to us to keep up relationships with Russian activists, with pro-democracy leaders, to make sure that when change does come, there are people there who can hopefully guide Russia in the right direction.
Thank you, Alina. And now, Michelle, we're going to get to you. Sorry for that interruption. But Michelle, you and I took part, as you know, last week in a discussion with an unnamed Egyptian journalist who described the situation which was about in Egypt, which was as bleak as could be. And yet even she found hope in some way. But you are a real specialist on Egypt, which is the most important country in the Arab Middle East. And it's been going, it seems to be much more repressive even than it was under Mubarak. Maybe you could talk about that and how you understand the possibilities and whether the election of a new administration in the United States, where Sisi is not going to be Biden's favorite dictator, whether that offers any possibility for change.
Well, thank you, Carl, and thanks to the Hamilton Lugar Center for inviting me to be part of this panel. Look, let me widen the aperture for a minute to the whole Middle East region, because I think there is going to be political change in this region over the next decade, just as there has been over the last decade. I mean, if we look back, as you know, there were two waves of popular uprisings in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, one 2011, 2012, another one in 2019, after everybody said, oh, the first wave failed, it's all over. And then huge uprisings just last year in 3 more countries, right? And so we've had, governments or leaders unseated in at least 7 countries so far. Wars, sadly, starting in 3 countries, and a potentially viable democratic transition in Tunisia, and we'll see perhaps Sudan as well. And then even aside from the Arab countries, you've had significant unrest at times in Iran and Turkey. So there's a lot going on in this region, and this era of turmoil is by no means over. I think the whole underlying social contract, which, in a way was built on oil or derivative of oil, either hydrocarbon rents or political rents. Larry has written a lot about this in the past. This era is ending. And it's breaking up, and these countries, they need productive economies, and that means the governments now need their citizens, right? They're going to need human capital to have productive economies. They're not going to be able to just, suck their wealth out of the ground or, from other international players to the extent that they've been able to. I think for now, the pandemic sort of pressed the pause button on protests in the Middle East, as it has in many places. But to me, the only question is when and where political turmoil will resurface, not if. Right. And I think, we may see it come back to some of the countries where we saw it before. Algeria, I think, very much unfinished business there. You mentioned Egypt. It's a very, very strong repression in Egypt. Actually, nothing like what it was under Mubarak, far worse now. And yet still, we've seen 2 in September 2019, actually a pretty big wave of anti-Sisi popular protests, and another one this fall about the same time. And that's in a place where people pay an enormous price to go out into the streets. So, the desire for change, the fact that the whole system throughout this region just isn't working anymore. Governments can't buy social peace. They don't have the money to do it, and their populations have increased a lot. So now the thing is, though, as maybe Alina was saying about Russia and some other places, just because there's change, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be in the direction of democracy. The desire for democracy is still there, but of course the pushback against it has been strong. Some of it's been by the regional powers. in different ways. Of course, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Turkey, they've all played roles, in different ways. And then, of course, Russia and China as well. But one thing I will say about these players that have been, dependent on hydrocarbon revenue is, of course, that's a waning asset. And, most of the projections that I've seen, global demand for oil and gas is going to be different projections. It could be that global demand will actually start going down in 10 to 15 years. Some people think we've already reached that point, that with the pandemic, that global demand will not go back to what it was before. I don't know. But in other words, even if it's 10 years away, it's tomorrow, right? If you're living on those revenues and you have no viable alternative plan for your economy, this is coming. It's coming fast. And we've seen a lot of things going on. For example, the United Arab Emirates normalization of relations with Israel, binding itself to one of the strongest military power in the region. I think it's all about their recognition that their days as a wealthy and important state are numbered, and that they need to, find a way. So what does this mean for the United States? Look, the United States it cannot bring democratic change to the Middle East. We can't control the actions of other leaders. And, ultimately, it all really depends on what the people in these 20 plus countries that I'm talking about, what they themselves want and how much they're willing to risk for it, right? But the questions, I do think the United States faces some really important questions related to supporting human rights and democracy in the Middle East. And the first one to me is the United States willing to stop doing some of the things that we're doing that actively impede the possibility of the spread of democracy in this region? Then the other question is, are we willing to proactively do some positive things we could do, but on what we're doing to impede democracy? For example, the issue used to be that the United States had partnerships with authoritarian regimes in the Middle East because we were dependent on the flow of oil, or at least the global economy was dependent on the free flow of oil from this region and so forth. And therefore, we had to have these relationships. Well, now the story is, of course, we're much less dependent. We in the United States are not dependent at all on hydrocarbons from the Middle East, and even the global economy, arguably, as I said, that dependence it will go down. We can see that era is coming to a close. So the United States priorities are shifting elsewhere. Now the United States wants to lower its investment in this region, its military presence, and so forth. So how do we do that? Well, of course, we still have allies. We still have interests. We still don't want terrorist threats coming out of this region and so forth. So now, the new argument but there's always a good argument for supporting authoritarianism in the Middle East. So it used to be that, this region is too important to us. We can't take any risks. So we have to just support these authoritarian leaders. Now it's, this region's not that important to us, and we want to get out. So let's support the authoritarian leaders. And what this means is we have to arm them to the teeth, right? So you've seen this huge potential arms sale to the United Arab Emirates, as a reward for its normalization with Israel. And then this will set off a regional arms race. And the argument in favor of this is, well, if the United States wants to have less of an actual physical military presence in the region, it's got to, as I said, arm its allies to the teeth. So I think this is an interesting policy discussion we will be having. It has already started. It's certainly already started in the Congress about what these governments in the Middle East, authoritarian governments, but who are allied with the United States, what they will do with these arms. Will it actually stabilize the region? They've been using them to intervene in each other's affairs and so forth militarily, to carry out some pretty human rights abuses amounting to war crimes. But just to say that, if we set off this big arms race as we're thinking about doing, those arms will be used to consolidate authoritarian control, repress citizens inside of countries, shore up authoritarianism in the region. So that's the sort of big, difficult choice that I think the United States has to face honestly. The easier part of it, frankly, is like, what are the constructive or proactive things the United States could do to support the spread of democracy in the Middle East, as I said, where it arises. I mean, we're not talking about imposing this, forcing it. We're talking about when people in the Middle East themselves rise up and start asking for accountable political systems and an end to corruption, all of these things, which they have done and they will do again. How do we react? And the big thing here, I think it's already been alluded to by a couple of the other speakers, is this issue of creating an enabling international environment, or a supportive international environment, by working with our democratic allies, with international institutions, international financial institutions, et cetera. Because this is something that we really failed to do this, for example, at the time of the first Arab Spring. It was really, I think, a big failure. And so, you know, what we see right now in the Middle East is we see people who want change. We see a couple of states in the region that have sort of fledgling democratic experiments, but they're in a very, very hostile environment, hostile regional environment, and very minimal support either from the United States, Europe, or it's and other democratic players. Just a quick word on the Biden administration and what they might do in, we certainly have seen, President-elect Biden has made a few promises already. He certainly promised a fresh look, a re-examination of relations with Saudi Arabia. He's, implied, as you said, no more blank checks for Sisi and so forth. So he and certainly has promised putting human rights and democracy back into a significant place in U.S. foreign policy. One thing I think we can expect is that President-elect Biden is not going to behave as though he owes Middle East authoritarian leaders a favor. For whatever reason, and some of these reasons are obscure, President Trump has behaved that way with Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, Sisi in Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey, and so forth. It's been this sort of unusual situation of you do me a favor, I'm going to do you a favor, and so forth. And I could recite some of these, but I imagine a lot of the people watching have heard about some in Egypt, for example. I mean, President Trump really did a few pretty unusual favors for President Sisi. And one wonders why, why did he feel he had to do that? I don't think President-elect Biden is going to look at it that way. And I do think that in a Biden administration, national security decision-making and the conduct of policy is going to return to something more recognizable, in terms of a, U.S. national security interests being at the center of it, as well as an interagency process and so forth. So, and by the way, there a number of the authoritarians in the Middle East are quite nervous about this right now, and they're out there hiring their lobbying firms.
Michelle, before I've gotten some questions, which I'll work them in, but I want to just raise one more question with you, which is, Tunisia is the first Arab democracy, and it's a very, very important thing to have a beachhead for democracy in the Middle East. And yet, even in Tunisia, there seems to be a reaction. I noticed the rise of this former Ben Ali official, this Abir Musi.
Abir Musi, yeah.
Yes, of the Free Historian Party. How dangerous is that? And can Tunisia remain democratic? And what can we do to help it?
Yeah, it's really important. Tunisia is now, moving toward its 10th anniversary of the beginning of its democratic transition. the big vulnerability in Tunisia has been the failure of the democratic experiment to deliver economically. Obviously, in all these countries, as we know, look, democracy is just a way of doing things. People want the goods, right? They want job opportunities. They want services from their governments. That this is what they want, and they, and maybe and freedom of expression and to be treated decently, to have rights and so forth. But so democracy is just like a way to make those things happen. And I think unfortunately in Tunisia right now, a lot of people are pretty sour on how I think they feel that it has delivered for them in terms of freedom of expression, and somewhat in human rights, maybe not as perfectly, across the board in human rights, but certainly it's a totally different, much freer climate in Tunisia. But the big vulnerability is the economy. They've not come up with a new economic model that would, that would go along with their new political model, of which they're very proud, and that has left them vulnerable. And then the other thing, as I mentioned, is they're in a terrible neighborhood for this, a very unsupportive neighborhood. I would say neighborhood-wise, the one thing that Tunisians have had going for them is that Algeria, their big next-door neighbor, has had a longstanding policy of non-interference in the affairs of other countries, and they actually pretty much practice that with Tunisia. But so there, it's a really difficult situation in Tunisia. And so I think it bears close watching, and it really could use more robust international support. Let me say the last thing. I think the United States and Europe, we have been very ambivalent about supporting democratic change in the Middle East. Really ambivalent and really weak in our support and sending conflicting signals and so forth. So, if you would just, Larry could do this in a moment, or I'm sure Alina, just contrast the type of international, diplomatic, economic, other support that flowed to Central and Eastern European countries after, as the breakup of the Soviet Union, compared to that went to Arab Spring countries. I mean, there's just no comparison.
Right, but they didn't fear they didn't fear the Islamists, which is what the argument is here. But
there you go. That is part of the ambivalence.
Larry, we're going to have another round, and Larry, I want you to respond to all of this, but I just also want to raise an issue that has just been not talked about enough, which is social media. We have a question from the audience about, freedom of expression versus hate speech. But there's also in social media, both the power of the authoritarian governments to use it, but then as we saw in Egypt, as we see today in Belarus, as Alina was talking about, as a lot of people have hoped for in China, social media is a force for mobilization. It's a force for spreading information and for raising aspirations of people. So Larry, comment on the discussion we've had already, and then if you'll give your own views on social media, and then I'll turn, and I think this may be, I don't know if we're going to have any more time, but I want to hear from the others on their views on the impact of social media, which is, the biggest revolutionary change of our time. Larry, go ahead.
Well, since a lot of what I'm concerned about now, Carl, are the negative implications of social media for democratic health and stability, let me start with the positive. You're right. And of course, Michelle knows intimately how important social media were to the mobilization behind the Arab Spring, and even very recently in Sudan, and the others you were talking about, Michelle, in 2019, Lebanon, and so on. So the ability of social media to mobilize uprisings, protests, resistance, remain extremely important. I do want to say even here, though, that, and this is, I think, extremely true of Hong Kong now, what happens then is you get these leaderless movements that don't have coordination, that lack strong leadership. And something that was crucial in many transitions to democracy, you can go all the way back to the book by Guillermo O'Donnell and Philippe Schmitter on transitions from authoritarian rule, where you get into this competitive dynamic between regime and opposition, and the ability of democratic movement leaders not only to mobilize, but to demobilize and to restrain and discipline their followers was crucial in the negotiations for democratic change. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, and a lot of work we can do to disseminate the tools of nonviolent civil resistance and of organization and creative protest beyond just protest in the streets. I think there's a lot of very creative work that's been done on this that we can disseminate around the world. On the negative side, we have enormous work ahead of us just in our own democracies, not to mention elsewhere in the world, to figure out how to break the paralyzing monopoly of the big social media companies. And here I would highly recommend to people Frank Fukuyama's path-breaking multi-authored article in Foreign Affairs recently on the possibility, I won't explain it now, for middleware, for an insert into the relationship between the Facebooks and the users to kind of soften this control and create a new form of democratic complexity and regulation that isn't state regulation. And I think we need, Carl, we need to ramp up civic education in the United States, in the world, all over, with a new generation of energy, of renewed commitment to the universal values that my colleagues have spoken about, and with timeliness to the current era we live in. And I keep citing the work of my Stanford colleague in the School of Education, Sam Weinberg, who's a specialist on civic education, but is working now on how we can educate young people for responsible use of social media and inquiring and discriminating use of social media, so they don't just believe at face value everything they read. And I think it is now urgently important, both for our own democracies in the US and Europe, say, but around the world, that we develop tools, programs, and regimens for civic education for responsible, non-polarizing, engaging social media use from a very, very early age.
Larry, that's terrific. And I want to just note that I mentioned before that David Skaggs had expressed his gratitude to Lee Hamilton. And one of the things he said in expressing his gratitude is that Lee has supported David Skaggs's work in developing networks of former members of Congress dealing with civic education. This is a very, very important area. And let me just say, while we're on the air, to the other Lee Feinstein, let's look at this as an area where we might cooperate, Lee, and maybe even bringing in Stanford in promoting civic education. It happens to be part of the NED's 5-year strategic plan. So let's talk about that. But before we break, I mean, I want to hear from our other three participants on this whole issue of social media, because Minjin, a lot of people had hopes that social media, the netizens in China, would be the instrument for liberalizing and opening that society, but it hasn't happened that way. As you said and explained, it's been the surveillance state. But what possibility is there in China for the internet, social media, the fact that so many hundreds of millions of people are connected to the internet? Is it possible to break through the great China firewall that they've built to block information coming to China?
Okay, well, I have looked at this issue, not just in the context of China, but in the context of democracy and autocracies in general. What I have found is that technology is an accelerant. It destabilizes societies and political systems that are already filled with tensions, that are already in some way fundamentally unstable. It does not do much to fundamentally stable societies, especially democracies. When you look at the impact of social media on social democracies in Europe, on Japan, on Taiwan, on South Korea, New Zealand, those high-performing democracies, you really don't see fundamentally destabilizing effect. Social media technology destabilizes democracy, and I would say autocracy, only in these societies that are already filled with social political tensions. So the relationship is not linear. So this is the first thing I want to say. In the case of China, what we've also seen is that today China has a very repressive system, and it's a relatively stable system. So social media does not have a lot of impact on the system. But however, when that system comes under stress, you do see a very significant impact. And here I'm alluding to the early 2 weeks of the COVID crisis in China. There was about 2 periods in which the government actually lost control over the narrative, over the social media. You saw very spontaneous mobilization in a society which is supposed to be under tight control of the modern surveillance state. So that gives us hope. So what this says is that what I'm thinking in theoretical terms is that when we see technology play a very important role and positive role in the future of the expansion of democracies, we're likely to see it undermine authoritarian regimes that are already in some fundamental ways unstable.
Thanks very much, Mitch. And we'll watch this very closely. You know, Alina, when you were talking before about Belarus, social media had and is having an enormous impact in Belarus because Lukashenko now, with the help of Putin, is controlling the media, but he does not control the social media platforms, which is giving information to the people of Belarus. Talk about the impact of social media, and briefly, because we're getting to the end of our time, in Belarus and in your region more generally, and whether or not this offers the possibility for positive change as opposed to more state interference and control.
Thanks, Carl. To answer your question briefly, but I actually think we're talking about something far beyond just social media platforms. In terms of how, especially American or Western social media companies are helping to keep opposition, pro-democracy movements alive, we really cannot underestimate that in places like Russia and Belarus. Alexander Navalny, for example, the Russian opposition leader who was poisoned just recently and almost lost his life, would not be known at all in Russia if it wasn't for YouTube. Because of course the state controls all of the broadcast and television media and newspapers. So still, despite many attempts by the Kremlin to try to suppress and push out, or at the very least gain so-called the encryption keys to various platforms, they failed. And they failed partially because many of the companies that continue to operate in these environments, of course, it's not the case with China, just refuse to comply with some of the local laws. And I think when we're talking about this broader question of tech regulation, we have to take into account the extent to which some of these platforms provide a lifeline to democracy activists. And I think there's a much bigger issue here. In all the years I've spent working on disinformation issues, and disinformation online is a huge issue, not just from Russia or China or other states, but domestically, of course. That's become the bigger problem for our democracies, is domestic disinformation. But it's become very, very clear that what we really need to be talking about is a joint democratically rooted digital policy that keeps technology and the development of technology and the innovation around emerging technologies rooted in a democratic domain. And right now we are hurtling down a very dangerous path where we see ourselves as in competition with each other. So Europe wants to compete with US companies because they don't have a Google or an Apple or an Amazon, et cetera. But the bigger problem here is that we're facing incursions and competition, of course, from China. What we need to do is band together. We can carve that up any way we want, but we need some sort of coalition of democracies to set the rules of the road when it comes to technology use and data access. Because without that, I think we forget that technology is also a vehicle for ideology. It is not value neutral. And if we let China set those rules of the road on the normative agenda at the international level, then we lose our ability to set a democratic agenda when it comes to technological progress and innovation.
And let me just say, Carl, it's very important to stress China is trying to write those rules of the road right now in international forums.
Right, and they're using the UN, and I think don't people realize this, and also various international platforms to do that, and that has to be a critical priority for any. It's not just a democracy agenda for a new Biden administration to understand what the threat is, because they're trying to take over the internet and to change the norms of the international community. Michelle, you know, everybody remembers in the January 25th revolution in Egypt in 2011, the role that social media played. And I think they exaggerated its importance for reasons that Larry talked about. But I think that's the reason these waves of protest are not over. The people's consciousness has just been raised enormously from what it was before. Maybe you could just say a brief word about that, Michelle, and what the possibility is for social media in the Middle East to help shape a more open and free democratic future.
Well, look, I think that social and political energies are kind of like water. They'll flow into the spaces that are open to them, right? So in a lot of the Middle East, you didn't have, you know, formal politics open to people. They couldn't have political parties. So all of a sudden you saw, you know, labor unions and student organizations or whatever being politicized, as has happened elsewhere in the world. Same thing with the media. It is, you know, I'm talking about 20 plus countries, and it's a different situation from one country to another, but in many of them, the broadcast media is very much controlled by the government, and the ability to actually use the public square to go out is constrained. There's been a terrible tendency in this region to write these very broad counterterrorism laws. So they can actually, you know, take people who walk out to protest or who put out a human rights report, they can bring them up on charges of terrorism and give them long sentences and so forth. So of course, social media, you know, is going to be a place where a lot of this energy is going to go. And it's a highly contested space. If there's one thing that a lot of the countries, especially the Arab countries in the Middle East, are great at cooperating on, it's how to crack down on social media. That's something that they talk to each other about, all their cyber crime laws and so forth, that become another tool of political repression, because it still works. I mean, I mentioned these unusual, you know, protests in Egypt a year ago and then now. Well, this was because of a former Egyptian military contractor giving, you know, talks about corruption at very high levels, including the presidency of Egypt, and he had the goods on them, you know, over Facebook, and millions of people watching. So, you know, social media is still really important. The last thing I want to say about this, you know, I was cautioning earlier about the sale of weapons, you know, from the West. And by the way, the United States and Europe competing with each other to sell weapons to the Middle East. This is our main form of engagement with the Middle East. But that also, of course, technology has been and can be weaponized. And we have seen companies in the United States, in Israel, selling, you know, technology to Arab states that is used for surveillance, for blocking of websites and other kinds of cyber repression. So that's another thing where, you know, we need to look ourselves in the mirror and see what we can clean up about what we and countries and our allies are doing to actually, you know, repress some of the few channels that are left to people to express themselves, exchange information, and mobilize.
Thank you, Michelle. That's a big problem. And obviously, of course, we've read a lot about it recently. It's also a big problem with China, where US companies are selling technologies which are used to do surveillance of the Uyghurs in East Turkestan and others in China. So it's a big, big problem. This has been a great discussion. And I want to thank all of you for this. It's really been illuminating at a very critical moment. I want to let the audience know that if you want to continue to be conversant in these issues with us, Larry is the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy, and you can go to our website or to the Journal's website to see how to get articles and subscription to the Journal. We publish a daily Democracy Digest, which tries to capture everything that's interesting that's being written on democracy on a daily basis, and you can get that if you write to us. And I want to thank the people from Indiana University who have helped put on this event. Of course, Janae Cummings and Sean England, who were operational, but also the two Lees, Lee Feinstein and Lee Hamilton, with whom we have a cherished relationship. And in conclusion, take a look at the lecture that Minjin will be giving on Thursday evening. It promises to be an important lecture, which will be published in the Journal. It's a great partnership we have with Indiana University, the NED and Indiana University, and with Lee's Hamilton Lugar School. We look forward to strengthening that partnership in the period ahead. And I thank everyone for participating in this important discussion today. Thank you.